Welcome to Oceanside Chat, Light Beyond Generations. This podcast was created to inspire, motivate, and provide insight through industry professionals sharing personal stories, career aspirations, and practical advice. Our guest is Tom Derry, CEO of the Institute for Supply Management and co-chair of UC San Diego's Institute for Supply Chain Excellence and Innovation. Time to get your feet wet in the business world and join us down by the water as we have an Oceanside Chat. Season 2, Episode 5, The Supply Chain Economy.
Welcome to Oceanside Chat. I'm Helen Wang, the host and editor of the program. I would like to recognize many supporters who have been attending our live sessions and listening to our podcast since the first season. I also like to welcome our fast-growing community for Season 2. You are the reason why we keep doing what we do. Have you ever wondered what are the relationships between the systems of economic and supply chain? In order to better understand and answer the question, let me begin today's session by sharing a few definitions. First, an economy is the large set of interrelated production, consumption, and exchange activities that determine how scarce resources are allocated. The production, consumption, and the distribution of goods and services are used to fulfill the needs of those living and operating within the economy, which is also referred to as economic system. A supply chain is a network between a company and its suppliers to produce and distribute a specific product or service to the final buyer. This network includes different activities, people, entities, information, and resources. The supply chain also represents the steps it takes to get product or service from its original state to the customer. Companies develop supply chains to reduce their costs and remain competitive in the business landscape. According to those definitions, both economy and supply chain study resource management to produce and distribute goods and services. For this episode, I invited an exceptional guest to explore a new concept of the supply chain economy. Please join me to welcome Tom Derry, CEO at Institute for Supply Management and a co-chair of the Institute for Supply Chain Excellence and Innovation at UC San Diego. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Helen. It's really great to be here. I'm proud of the audience we're building. It's fun to see that.
Yeah, that's the most exciting part of our show. I'd like to ask you a few questions to begin with. Besides your CEO title and the LinkedIn profile, what is one thing we don't know about you?
Well, this is an old dinner party trick. And the one I usually use is the fact that I've run 3 marathons.
Wow.
People don't assume that about me. Yeah.
Wow, that's fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. If you could instantly become an expert in something, what would it be?
Oh, that's a good question. Carpentry, maybe.
Oh, really? Why?
Yeah, I love working with my hands. And I think the amount of skill that's required to build, a beautiful piece of furniture or a cabinet, I think most people don't appreciate the amount of skill that's required to do something so well. I just find that fascinating.
Yeah, I bet you get a lot of satisfaction by doing that.
Yeah.
Wow. Founded in 1915, ISM is the oldest and the largest supply management association in the world. So could you briefly describe ISM and its contribution to the economic data?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. We're very proud of it. There's a very interesting history around that. We began publishing economic data for the manufacturing sector of the US economy in 1932 at the request of the Hoover administration. We were in the Depression at that point, and there wasn't good, reliable economic data on production activity in the US economy. And of course, the US economy back then was much more manufacturing centric than it is today. and the National Association of Purchasing Agents, as it was known back then, NAPA, the government tried and failed to do it itself. So the NAPA stepped in and said, our members will be able to provide that insight. So we've been doing it since then. And interestingly, there was only one interruption. We stopped during World War II because the data on the level of efficiency and productivity in the US economy was a sensitive military secret during the war. And so we didn't publish that data because we didn't want to, show our hands to our enemies during the war. And we resumed after the cessation of hostilities in World War II and have been publishing ever since. In 1998, we launched the services PMI, which covers the services sector of the economy, because the services sector of the economy is actually about 88% of all economic activity in the United States. So not covering the service sector was an obvious gap. And we did that again at the request of the US government. The Commerce Department approached the ISM and said, would you be able to cover the services sector? And we said, sure, we can do that. So we've been publishing that data for more than 20 years. And in fact, we still brief the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and the White House privately every single month, just before the data becomes published, because among other things, it's market moving. It moves the capital markets. And both the Fed and the White House have to be prepared in case the markets move dramatically, either up or down, and be prepared to take action in that case. So we're very proud of the centrality of the data. And I'll just make one last comment. When you think about the data that we report at ISM, when we're collecting the data, we're collecting it from people whose job it is to understand the downstream demand they're trying to satisfy with their customers, right? And they're also literally sit at the intersection of supply and demand. And they're trying to reach equilibrium for their own firm. And when you aggregate those insights across hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of firms across the United States, you get a very profound look at the movement of GDP, the movement of supply and demand in the economy, and some corollary factors like inflation and so forth. Because of the unique position our members occupy, they have, in aggregate, a very profound point of view on changes in the US economy.
You publish manufacturing PMI, which is capturing the supply-demand dynamics in the manufacturing sector. And you also do service PMI. From your website, you also do a hospital PMI. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's an interesting story there too. So the hospital sector, which is a subsegment of the overall healthcare sector, is very important. Healthcare in the United States comprises almost 20% of GDP, 18 or 19%. So as that sector moves, it has a significant impact on the overall economy. In one of the White House briefings back in June of 2014, I was asked by the staff economists if we could explain why the economy surprisingly went into contraction. I said, yeah, we reported that, but people didn't believe us. The economy in 2013 had been growing very strongly. They thought maybe our data was wrong. Well, turns out our data was accurate, as it always is. And they said, what happened? We got this surprise contraction in the first 2 months of 2014. We don't understand why. Well, we went back and looked at the data. January 1st of 2014 was the first full implementation of the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. And what happened? Well, you had hospitals and the entire healthcare system completely uncertain about the impact of this new law on their revenue streams. Are we going to be making more money, less money? Nobody really knew. And so what happens when you're uncertain in business? You pump the brakes, right? So you say, all right, no more construction projects. We're not going to backfill those openings on the staff. We're not going to buy that expensive piece of MRI equipment or whatever, right? We just hold off on all those things under the new law. It turns out if you pump the brakes on 20% of the US economy, you get a 2% contraction in the economy like that. So I told the White House, it's obvious to us, the implementation of the Affordable Care Act caused the healthcare sector to be very cautious. And because they were cautious or because they're so big, that had a big impact on the total US economy. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to focus on the hospital sector. Now, coincidentally, we couldn't have, of course, anticipated the pandemic, but we introduced the hospital PMI in August of 2020, when the pandemic sort of really became a serious concern in the United States in March of 2020. And so we were able to chronicle some of the unique pain points of that industry. You might remember that we put off a lot of our discretionary healthcare services, right? Hospitals were gearing up to deal with these very sick patients. So the acuity of the case mix was very high, very seriously sick people. But we weren't getting the discretionary revenues coming in. So the hospitals had the double whammy of having revenues drop off the table and having to serve a very sick population at the same time. So we kind of had a front row seat at the healthcare sector battling the pandemic.
That's very telling. Could you tell us about the scope of ISM? Where do you get your data?
The economic data is purely in the United States. However, the scope of ISM is global. We have members in 100 countries. We're the largest in the world. Our next biggest country market outside of the United States is actually the People's Republic of China, closely by South Korea. And when you think about global supply chains, those two locations make sense. We're the largest certifying body in supply chain. When we refreshed our certification a few years ago, we collected data from 2,500 people in 50 different countries, 720,000 separate data points. So it really is a global view. And that's what ISM brings to understanding of supply chains. Now, when it comes to the economic data itself, we cover all 18 sectors of the industrial side of the economy, all 18 sectors of the services. Coincidentally, it happens to be the same number, but it's all 36 sectors of the economy. And we do it in a way that each industry sector's contribution is commensurate with its contribution to overall GDP. So we know that if transportation equipment moves up or down, what the impact is going to be on US GDP overall. So our industry verticals are something that we are interested in rolling out more of. Now, we're frequently asked for those because we do have particular insight, although we're not publishing it today, on which industries are experiencing growth and which industries are experiencing contraction, and some of the reasons why those industries might be experiencing that.
I think those data will be super helpful. It's also very telling and symbolic. When we're trying to understand the supply chain, just the index that you publish, manufacturing has its own complicated supply chain, services segment as well, also healthcare and every industry you are tracking. No wonder your monthly announcement of PMI data greatly influence investor and business confidence.
Yeah, it's released at 10 a.m. Eastern time on the first business day of the month. That's the manufacturing. On the third business day, we release the services sector, and Wall Street waits for it, and trading activity happens immediately. In fact, the low latency firms that provide data to the high frequency traders in Wall Street, they publish our data exactly at 10 a.m. There was a glitch back in June of 2014. The data was released about 300 milliseconds prior to 10 a.m. in Chicago. And $60 million worth of trades were executed in 300 milliseconds.
Wow.
That's how impactful it is on Wall Street.
Yeah.
And actually, it's humbling. The power and influence of the data we publish is pretty amazing. So we're taking it very seriously. We can never make a mistake. We know how closely followed it is, and we take a lot of pride in the work that we do there.
You made all of us working in supply chain very proud as well, because we definitely have a big part of the economic impact.
Yeah, we're going to talk about it today, but I think since the beginning of the 21st century, you could argue the most single important thing in the global macroeconomy is how the global supply chain is operating at any one moment in time. We can talk about some of the reasons why that is the case, but I think many people, because of the pandemic, have begun to appreciate, wow, we're really dependent on these other countries and these other suppliers. We as professionals understood that already, but even our government didn't understand the extent to which we were dependent, and consumers didn't understand it. But I think they appreciate that now.
Mm-hmm. This is a good time to reveal the answer for the poll question on the screen. Let me share the result here. So the question is a single choice question. What percentage of the US economy is contributed by the supply chain and its ecosystem? So most answer 70% or more. That's 30% of the audience voted for that. And 32% saying between 50 to 70. And then 26% saying don't know. Don't know is a good one because we really don't have a clear way to track it as of today. And the smallest category is 5%, falling between 10 to 30% of contribution. So Tom, what's your perspective? How do you help us to read this data, and how would you help us to better understand this?
Yeah, I think the people who answered don't know are the wisest respondents for sure, because it's really hard to measure. But one simple way to think about it is how import and export driven is the US economy, especially in comparison to other economies around the world. So it turns out exports only make up about 12% of US GDP. And the value of imports coming into the United States also is about 12%. One way you could think about it simplistically is that about a quarter of the economy is formally driven by imports and exports flowing into and out of the economy. But that understates the size of the contribution a little bit, because there are some of these components that come in that are re-exported and re-imported. That's certainly the case in industries like automotive, for instance. So if you wanted to think about the level of employment that was supported in the United States by the supply chain industry, you'd have to include industry sectors like distribution and warehousing and logistics. They're not appearing in the import-export data that I just cited, but they're a huge sector of the economy. We've seen the issues that we've had in logistics in the last couple of years, right? Congestion in the ports at Los Angeles and Long Beach. We have a chronic shortage of truck drivers right now. Even railway freight is something that has been a source of issues in the US supply chain in the last couple of years. So if you wanted to think more broadly, probably that answer of 50 to 70% is about right. First, Boeing is the largest exporter in the United States, exports high-value airplanes to airlines all around the world. That one company accounts for a large part. It really depends on how you measure the contribution overall. And I'll just contrast the US with a couple of other economies. Germany, for instance, 47% of Germany's GDP is driven by exports, right? So it's all those automobile brands that we know, BMW, Mercedes, Volkswagen, all those brands, all the auto parts that support that industry, all the sophisticated machinery, high-tech manufacturing machinery that they export to manufacturing locations all over the world. They're a heavily export-driven economy. And if something were to interfere with their export opportunities, it would have a severe, outsized, disproportionate impact on their economy. Some other economies are somewhat, 36% is the number for South Korea, so also a very heavily export-dependent economy. And then it moderates a little bit. China's about 18% for exports, so is Japan. And I mentioned the United States is about 12. So in some ways, the US benefits from being a little bit insulated from the global economic system. During the pandemic, that's not totally true. But in comparison to some other countries, we have more resiliency built into the US economy because we're less dependent on our trade relationships with other countries.
So maybe, just a maybe, Tom, that ISM could start a formula or a way to capture the true supply chain impact to the economic data. Look up to an organization like ISM to come up with something in addition to the GDP capture that you just described.
Really, really good idea. It's going to take a lot smarter people than me to work on it.
Yeah, I will certainly invite you back once you have that golden formula for us in the near future. We have to know the past to understand the present. Tom, although ISM has more than 100 years of history, we won't have enough time today to go back to a century ago. But I would like to exchange our ideas and share perspectives for the past few decades that shaped today's economic system and the global supply chain. Where should we begin?
Well, I'd like to begin the historical perspective with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, going back just over 30 years. And I think that's highly relevant. And I'll just mention a few key factors. So following the fall of the Berlin Wall in 89, the first major economic event to follow in sequence behind that was reunification of Germany in 1990, which you have to remember, Germany is an outsized economy in Europe overall. And Germany's economic needs arguably were a primary cause of both the First World War and the Second World War. Highly developed industrial base, but lacking the natural resources for their energy-intensive industries. So both the First and Second World War, one of the proximate causes was German need for coal in France to generate their required energy supply. So the reunification of Germany, therefore, was kind of a seismic economic event in the world. Then we had the collapse of the USSR in 1991. And so that bipolar structure that we had geopolitically no longer existed. People forget NAFTA only came into existence, not the USMCA, but NAFTA came into existence in 1994. And then the WTO replaced the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade in 1995. So that was a major change. That paved the way for the so-called rules-based system of international trade. It's only been since 1999 that the euro's been in existence. We kind of have taken the euro for granted. It's been around for more than 20 years, but in fact, in terms of economic history, it's a relatively recent development. China acceded to the WTO in 2001, which was a huge event for the globalization of the macroeconomy. I think in the West had expectations of China, because of its participation in the global economy, becoming a little more Western-oriented in its thinking and its ways. Well, of course, that has not materialized. That theory proved to be flawed, but China is an economic powerhouse. China's GDP was just a little over $400 billion in 1992. Today, it's about $15 trillion. So the Chinese economy has grown by a factor of 30 in the last 2 decades. And that alone is probably the single most important factor of the global economic period of the last 3 decades. The level of poverty that's been eradicated as people moved to the East Coast cities and got involved in manufacturing in China, for instance, probably the biggest economic migration we've seen in human history. And I would say for those 2 decades, between 1990 and 2010, there was a broad consensus around the benefits of international trade and an opening up of markets generally. And then from about 2010 on, we began to see some fragmenting of that consensus, which I think has grown a little bit in the last 10 years. So if you go from 2010 to 2022 today, remember in 2010, China imposed export restrictions on the export of rare earth minerals. It has a near monopoly on rare earth minerals. It was unhappy with its price, the prices it was receiving in the global market. And so it slowed down the export of those rare earth minerals. It lost that case in 2014 to the WTO, but is a precedent in my mind of China willing to test the rules-based system of the global economy when it's in its own self-interest to do so. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see examples of that going forward. In 2018, the Trump administration announced its Section 232 tariffs on aluminum and steel, ostensibly for national security reasons. And I think that kind of let the cat out of the bag. It made it an acceptable policy choice for many governments around the world to impose tariffs again for the first time really in 20 years. My favorite recent example is in 2019, Japan imposed export restrictions on critical technologies to South Korea that are required for its semiconductor industry, its cell phone manufacturing industry, its computer industry, because of a political dispute that actually started all the way back to World War I and some of its origins. The use of conscripted labor, the use of so-called comfort women during World War I and World War II. Japan contends that this political dispute was settled by treaty agreement, and South Korea is now unhappy with that agreement and has been making noises about revisiting the settlement and clearly thinks that history is behind it. And in order to deal with the political dispute, hit South Korea where it hurt in terms of imposing export restrictions that hurt its economy. So I would suggest Brexit is the other seminal event from 2016. That vote is often interpreted as the people of Great Britain saying, we're unhappy about people from continental Europe coming in and taking jobs from us here in the UK. So it was often interpreted as a reaction to globalization as perceived by the citizenry of the UK. I wouldn't say that the pendulum against globalization has swung all the way back, but I would say that it has swung back in the direction of recognizing that globalization has maybe not uniform impacts for the benefit of everybody in the economy. I mean, economists would argue that the principle of comparative advantage means we're all better off if we specialize in things we do well. And the standard of living for everybody in all countries improves when comparative advantage is followed. But countries have a hard time sometimes with the sovereignty issues associated with the globalizing economy. And the dislocations caused by globalization are real and felt in everyday lives. The manufacturing base in the United States has declined pretty rapidly since NAFTA in 1994. While overall everyone's standard of living is better off, if I worked in highly specified manufacturing of valves in the oil and gas industry, well, we don't make any of those products anymore. Those are all made in China. I had highly specialized skills that I no longer have an outlet for. What am I going to do for a living? So there is short-term pain and dislocation, and governments have to deal with that kind of reality, even though they are making the case that we're all better off in the long run. It's the classic trade-off in economics between short-term pain and long-term gain.
WTO was established in 1995. Their primary purpose is to open the trade to the benefit of all. I would like to add 2005, there was a famous book published by Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat.
Right.
And then Friedman believes the world is flat in the sense that the competitive playing field between the industry and the emerging market countries leveling. The individual entrepreneur as well as companies, both large and small, are becoming part of a large, complex global supply chain extending across oceans with competition spanning entire continents. After China joined WTO in 2001, China became the manufacturing for the world. And I joined Foxconn in 2003, and then was recruited by Apple in 2005, and then by Google in 2013. So as a result, I have witnessed the massive transition of outsourcing and offshoring that resulted in China's epic growth. So based on the economic theory, the collective society made a choice to optimize scarce resources to produce and distribute goods and services. That was a new word, as Friedman described. The US set the tone and led the way, but many others benefited in the slipstream. So in other words, throughout my professional career, most industry and companies have enjoyed the benefits of globalization and found no reason to make any change. But of course, the frictional examples that you gave earlier has changed the things, moving towards something differently. By the end of 2020, ISEI, our institute at UC San Diego, led the PGM research. We called it post-globalization research, and presented our result to the United Nations with audience from more than 30 countries. The movement was triggered by geopolitical tension, trade war, and accelerated by pandemic, and increased the risks beyond industry control. We actually made a few projections. From short-term standpoint, while China is doing a great job to remain competitive and it continues to grow its capacity, the China Plus strategy, whether it's +1, +2, plus multiple, is happening and it will continue in the next few years. And the Southeast Asia country will benefit from this rebalancing opportunity. From midterm standpoint, the projection lead to a regionalization model for a balanced approach between efficiency and resilience, and also trying to get closer to customers to avoid the supply chain disruption. From long-term standpoint, we think US has a real chance to be one of the long-term contenders for the upstream value supply chain enabled by technology and innovation, and in partnership with Mexico in North America. And of course, Latin America and Eastern Europe also present significant potential. The last projection was before the Russian-Ukraine war, which bring a new threat and risk to Eastern Europe countries that potentially could play a major role in the supply chain. So this brings us to today, which seems like a new wave is once again upon us. The World Economic Forum described the phenomenon as globalization 4.0. In a world increasingly dominated by two global powers, as you also mentioned earlier, the US and China. The new frontier of globalization also involves cyber world. The digital economy is further enabled by artificial intelligence. Tom, in your perspective, what's driving the supply chain in the future?
Well, there are two things I think that are first and foremost in my mind, and one of them is kind of highly concerning and the other maybe not so much. So let's start with the concerning one first. Part of the fallout from the Russia-Ukraine war has been the shutting down, for instance, of social media in Russia, right, as an alternative means of people in Russia getting information about the prosecution of the war. We've seen that in China and other times for different reasons. And so it's led to something that people are theorizing about, which would be called the splinter net, not the internet, but a series of sort of separate internets that don't necessarily talk to one another. And the internet has been such a powerful force for democratization and globalization and information sharing and technology change and innovation, that I think that would be a shame. And similarly, as people are probably aware, one of the sanctions imposed on Russia as a result of their invasion of Ukraine was to kick them off the SWIFT messaging. So SWIFT stands for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Transactions. It's a messaging system that allows banks to confirm cross-border banking transactions. And if you're not on SWIFT, it's hard for you to trade internationally. China and Russia have talked about developing an alternative platform to SWIFT. SWIFT is by its nature a global platform today. And actually, the current CEO of Foxconn, Helen, has made this point. Foxconn is opening facilities in the United States, although it's heavily concentrated today in mainland China. And he himself has said, we could see a polarization happening in the global economy where we essentially have two sets of competing economies and two globalized supply chains. One being China-centric and Asia-oriented, and one being US-centric and Western-oriented. And I think since a dynamic force, a driving force, an imperative of developing supply chains is efficiency, not just price efficiency, but price efficiency among them. By very definition, having two bipolar supply chains or economic systems be less efficient than a globalized system today. So that's a little bit of a concern. I do think that regionalization that you described is real and is happening. ISM has some new research that indicates that for firms with a major supply chain presence in China, which is most global, 30% of them right now have already begun to move some of their supply chain presence outside of mainland China or plan to do so. So that's the first concrete evidence that ISM has seen of people saying, yeah, the China plus one strategy or China plus two is real, and companies are acting on it. And remember, the tariffs that the Trump administration imposed are still in place today. And so those tariffs continue to be a major driver of decisions around where do I source based on the commodities I need and the industry that I'm in. So there's a concern around that. But ultimately, the potential benefit of this resiliency from a more regionalized supply chain structure globally probably is to the benefit of both the national security and economic security of countries and people around the globe. And here's why I say that. We always had the supply chain risk as part of the equation, especially in the 90s and early 2000s. The overwhelming advantage of labor cost arbitrage, the advantage of being a low-cost manufacturing environment like China, so overwhelmed any other cost in terms of component of your cost of goods sold that none of the other components matter. Well, the labor arbitrage piece isn't there anymore, and we sort of forgot to price in the risk. And we saw that during the pandemic. 80% of the world's active pharmaceutical ingredients come from China today. And all the medicines that we depend on, for cancer patients or pandemic patients, or you name it, all of those critical medicines, we depend on China for those active pharmaceutical ingredients. If there was a reason for China to turn off that spigot, it would cause major chaos in the world economy. Finding other places to source from and acknowledging that we may have to pay a little higher price for the trade-off of having more resiliency and the opportunity to shift production to a second supplier in case of need, I think that's probably a healthy benefit. I think purists would say supply chain costs, like water, always seeks its lowest level, and we're going to get there over time. But I know pharmaceutical companies who are actively pursuing dual sourcing strategies today. So I think the environment has changed. And I think CEOs and boards recognize the risk of permanent loss of market share, of foregone sales because you're experiencing stockouts and your competitor isn't. The sort of fragility of sole source and single source supply-based systems we have commonly around the globe today. So I do believe that we're moving to a different environment slowly over time. And I do believe that will include nearshoring, but I don't believe it will include reshoring to the United States. I think the United States is still a high-cost country to do business in. Tariffs and taxes make it a high-cost country to do business. And I think, for instance, in the United States, both Mexico and Canada, but particularly northern Mexico, makes more sense as a nearshoring destination for companies that were sourcing from China. And I actually know of many examples of companies that are in Mexico today and have left China.
This is so interesting. It's such a rich content. I have so many follow-up questions and thoughts to share. So first of all, the long-term projection that our PGM project has made in terms of upstream, US as a real contender, when there's technology innovation driven, I give an example. When you look at the semiconductor section, right, it requires a lot of technology, it requires a lot of talented labor force, as well as huge capex investment. Mm-hmm. And in the past, we don't think that's possible in the US, but now people are building more fabs in the US. Those companies also doing investment in Europe. And I just saw a huge announcement from Intel yesterday. They're putting their semiconductor supply chain system within Europe. This speaks perfectly about what's the cost for risk, what's the price for risk. And it's probably not being very much discussed in the past, but nowadays, I think it's really started happening when it's strategically critical to the country's competitiveness or to the region's competitiveness. And then there is a price for the risk, and then people are willing to invest to overcome that risk.
Yeah, there are some countervailing trends. I agree with you, Helen. Even when it comes to things like rare earth minerals I mentioned earlier, rare earth minerals aren't rare in the sense that they're scarce from a geographical perspective. They're here in the United States. We just prefer not to mine for them, right? We let other countries mine for them. So we've made both explicit and implicit or conscious and unconscious decisions about the kinds of things, economic activities we're willing to support in our country and other places around the world. And those come with trade-offs and risks. The countervailing trend is the rise of a third kind of company that economists have noticed over the last couple of decades. They refer to them as factoryless goods producers, or FGPs. A good example would be Google or Nike, for example. They want to own the R&D, they want to own the brand, but they don't want to own manufacturing assets, which are kind of low margin, right, and highly difficult to run and susceptible to disruption. And so the idea is that if I own the R&D and I own the brand, the profits tend to pool at that level, and I can pay low margin dollars to someone else to make it for me. And there's been a dramatic change in the United States. I don't know if it's going to shift back, but go all the way back to 1970, the average member of the S&P 500, 80% of its total cost structure was in the four walls of the firm. In 2020, 50 years later, it was about 50%. And so it's a 60% change, a massive change, actually a revolutionary change in how we think about how firms should organize themselves. It directly related to the allocation of scarce resources that you mentioned earlier, Helen, and the idea that if another company is better at the manufacturing work, why do I want that vertically integrated and do it less well? I'll pay somebody else to do it, and I'll get a better product, and I'll be more profitable. So the question is whether this movement towards resiliency can overcome the powerful economic imperative of, the economic sense that outsourcing makes. And it's an unknown situation, it's unresolved today. I think the safe bet is we're moving a little bit back in the direction of more local production. And the last factor, the United States historically has not been a country that's been very friendly to industrial policy, the way it's practiced in China, the way it's practiced in France and other places where those countries make a decision around the strategically critical industry sectors they believe are necessary for their economic security or their military security or both, and they invest. We prefer to let the market forces dictate which industries thrive, which companies thrive, and which do not. And I think the Biden administration is more open to the argument. Clearly, what's happening in semiconductors and the clear policy out of the Commerce Department today, form of industrial policy, where we're announcing incentives to build up a semiconductor industry in this country, which is not necessarily a bad thing. If nothing else, some of our critical military systems depend on these technologies, and we could be highly vulnerable if those supply chains got disrupted.
I would like to offer one piece of data point that may be helpful to support the discussion we had earlier. From the Global Risk Report in 2022, published in January, along with the World Economic Forum. The economic disruption from the pandemic has also created a stronger incentives for the vaccinated world to prioritize resilience over cost minimization. Mm-hmm. And governments and industry may now drive regional convergency at the expense of global integration as they seek to minimize supply chain disruptions. Another thing I thought was very interesting is so-called climate change and sustainability movement, because the negative part of the globalization also expanding. through the global effect of climate change. Pollution in one part of the world leads to extreme weather events in another, as well as the world's capacity to cope with hazard greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a clear driving force from the climate change and sustainability in terms of where should the supply chain positioned and resource being allocated in a way that causes less damage to the planet that we're living. What are your thoughts about that?
I agree. The folks who publish data on greenhouse gas emissions, have kind of segmented those emissions into three scopes, as they're referred to: scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And 80% of greenhouse gas emissions occur in the so-called scope 3, which is actually the supply base of all of our firms. So the only way we can make meaningful impact on heating up of the atmosphere, CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions, and mitigate some of the climate change that we're experiencing, is that we begin to be serious about our supply base. And ISM talks to companies all the time, but where are you in that process? And the answer is none of them are very far along today. Beverly Raskin just withdrew her nomination to be the Fed Vice Chair of Bank Supervision. She'd been nominated by the Biden administration. And one of the reasons she ran into trouble in the confirmation process, she's been outspoken as a private about the impact of certain industries on climate change. And she seemed to be advocating the reallocation of capital away from some of those industries and in favor of industries that are maybe more climate friendly. And that's a somewhat controversial point of view. I wouldn't say that's universally accepted right now. On the other hand, the ESG movement is clearly a vehicle for directing capital to more climate friendly companies. I mean, Larry Fink at BlackRock has said this. Banks have made noise about, if I'm going to loan you money and you're not a climate friendly industry, you're going to pay me higher interest than someone who is more climate friendly. So if we begin to see allocation of capital based on non-economic conditions, well, arguably non-economic, then that's a big change. I do believe that the triple bottom line, people, planet, and profit, matters to the younger generations, for sure. And they make purchasing decisions based on the perceived values of the companies they do business with and how aligned they are with their own personal values. I do think that so many companies have made public pronouncements about we're going to be carbon neutral or net carbon zero by a date. It clearly has gotten the attention. And by the way, ISM data shows it's a top-down driven initiative. So it's driven by the board and or the CEO, but execution is usually handed off to the chief procurement officer, chief supply chain officer, who have actually got the relationships where they can make the difference and can measure the improvement. So I do think it's a wave of the future in supply chain. The question is, how fast will we get there?
As a tradition of the program, I hope to build an intellectual bridge between the current and future generations. Einstein said, any intellectual fool can make things bigger and more complex. It takes touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction. So Tom, how would you like to paint a picture for the supply chain economy by giving a new perspective?
Thank you, Helen. I really enjoy the chance to think about this. I had a lot of fun with it. The analogy I'd like to point the audience's attention to is the ocean. Like supply chains, the ocean is constantly in motion. And if you know how the oceans behave, there are really kind of three sources of motion. There's tidal movement, which is kind of close to shore and is related to the gravitational force of the moon, typically. There's surface current movement, which is related to wind currents generated by the thermal energy of the sun. Those tidal and surface currents you might think of as horizontal movement in the system. Vertically, there's something called a deep ocean current, which occurs at both the North and the South Pole, related to temperature of the water and salinity of the water. But what happens is the water gets colder and saltier. It sinks to the bottom of the ocean, and then it begins to migrate. And it takes 1,000 years for 1 cubic meter of water to complete its circuit of the globe in these patterns. So I think a supply chain can be seen as not just a horizontal phenomenon, but both horizontal and vertical. By my analogy, I would say tidal changes and surface current changes are kind of economic policy changes that are set by countries and governments around the world. But those longer term things like globalization, like innovation, like technological change that are irresistible economic forces, they drive how supply chains develop, as we've seen over the last 30 years. So we use the term supply chain because it's convenient and it connotes the linkages between events because it points out that the weakest link in the supply chain is where all the pressure will come. But it really doesn't address how supply chains really operate, which is more as systems. And I think the ocean might be a good metaphor for understanding how the system impacts. It constrains our ability to move within a supply chain because the parameters are set by the system. Just like you're navigating based on tides and currents, your options within a supply chain system are somewhat constrained.
I love the ocean science applied to the supply chain system, how you describe the source of motions and how that interdependent from one to the other, then eventually make that system keep moving, very much relevant to today's environment, because we do get all the dynamics and the forces from different sources of energy that triggered the movement of the supply chain. Love it. Thank you, Tom, for coming up with this brilliant idea. I also have one to share with you. The supply chain economy is similar to a blueprint for a house. The economic system provides housing for people, including big houses named countries and small ones called industries. The supply chain network provides backbone utilities to operate these houses by producing and distributing energy throughout the interrelated rooms. Like the gas shortages caused by the Russian-Ukraine war, reliance, congestion, and damage to the utility system will disrupt people's life. Therefore, each house must efficiently use and exchange the limited resources while protecting the entire system from exposed risks.
I think that's brilliant. One interesting thing is that there are some industries that are bigger than a lot of countries. So the size of the house might vary a little bit. The allocation of resources among those entities is really important. As our friend Tom Linton would say, a supply chain is really materials in motion. I think either one could accurately describe. It's good for us to think systemically about the supply environment and the set of related activities that is supply, and to understand what influences the systemic model. Right. And I think we've done a pretty good job today in terms of economic factors of pointing out some of the significant factors that influence the overall functioning of the system and how the system might evolve.
I would love to pick the audience question related to the raw material, anything like metals, fabrics, sensor, things like that, because the availability of the raw material may not be necessary within the region. The question is, how can we make company to invest to have more availability of the raw material within North America?
Well, you're going to have to change the economic system and incentives. That's for sure. And it's going to come with some cost. If we allow the profit motive to run rampant, companies are going to construct themselves the most efficient profit-driving way they can, and they're going to disregard the cost of pollution. And so a role for a government entity is to say, no, we're not going to accept that. We're going to put some guardrails around that. We're going to promote a healthy environment. So we're going to have to accept things like more mining. We're going to have to lower our taxes. We're going to have to eliminate tariffs. And if we do that, then we'll be able to do things. I mean, textiles, we can bring textiles back to this country. And by the way, to the extent that labor costs are a big factor in providing raw materials, we have to think about the country's immigration policy. And I think there are people who would love to live and work in this country at a livable wage compared to their wage at home. We have a shortage of workers in this economy. We need immigrant labor to help us.
So that actually connects to the next question. What role, if any, could a university play in developing a workforce that are competing with the supply chain networks in Asia?
Well, the skill set that's going to be required going forward, much more about tracking a flow of information than it is about the flow of goods. And so understanding how to use data and analytics to anticipate disruptions to supply chain and resiliently and agilely shift so that you don't get caught by that event. We're much better at weather prediction than we were in the past, and so that's less of an impact today. But surprisingly, the number of factory fires just the last year has doubled. And I don't know if that's pandemic related. For instance, you don't have as many people on the floor investing in the safety measures around making sure that the plant is safe. You're just trying to keep production running. Those kinds of impacts that throw off the performance of a global supply chain, really important. So being able to use statistical process control, understand machine learning and algorithms, the universities have a real role to play in training a workforce to do those kinds of things.
Tom, what are the key learnings and takeaways you want our audience to remember?
Well, we're back in a world where geopolitics matters. For the last 30 years, we didn't have to think about it, and companies could take for granted opening global markets and serve global customers. That's not the case anymore. Number two takeaway, the consumer and governments both are very sensitized now to the consequences of the globally extended supply chain, and they're a little uncomfortable with it. And we could see some regulatory pressure and compliance pressure around that. And the third one is compliance overall in supply chains is a much higher concern, whether it's human trafficking, or it's fair labor practices, that's the source of some of these rare earth minerals, the Congo, for instance, the conflict minerals. We're going to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act just came into law in the United States in December. People are realizing this globally integrated economy exposes us to certain kinds of risks and behaviors that maybe we're not comfortable with. And so as supply chain professionals, it's going to become our responsibility to monitor and audit those kinds of conditions and report back to our shareholders, our customers, and to governments about what we're doing about it.
That's great. I would like to remind our audience, supply chain system serves as a backbone of our society. And everyone probably know more about the supply chain than you realized. And your company is part of supply chain system. And you, every one of us is part of supply chain resources, wearing a hat as a consumer, a producer, or a distributor. So Tom, I appreciate your partnership exploring the economy and the supply chain relationship. And I also hope this is the beginning of many more conversations about the supply chain economy. I also like to thank everyone who attend our live webinar and also listening to our podcast. Please share with your network if you find our program stimulating and helpful. We look forward to seeing you again in the next episode. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to Oceanside Chat. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you liked it, please share this podcast and stay tuned for our next episode. We'll see you later.